Hey guys, welcome back. So today we're working on this 2500 PSI Troy-built pressure washer. This is powered by a Honda GCV 160, and you can tell from looking at it, this machine has spent quite a bit of time, I would say, outside. There is a bunch of rust, the paint is flaking, and the general condition is pretty poor. That said though, it was in the trash. I grabbed it, not because I think it would run, but because the stand is actually a good stand for testing engines that I rebuilt. Of course, there is a possibility that this actually still works. Usually on these cheaper machines, the pump goes out, and that's why these end up in the trash. But this one I am not so sure about because the engine, although it rotates, it does not feel like there's a lot of compression. It actually feels like there is really high leak down. So if we're really lucky, maybe we just need to adjust the valves. That'll bring the engine back to life, and potentially the pressure washer might be good. So let me get you set up a little bit better and get going on this. All right, so first things first, let's check the oil. Make sure it has some. These machines don't have a low oil system. And yeah, there is oil. It's pretty dark, but there is no smell of fuel in it. So I think it's good enough to test with. I'm going to make this one earn its oil change. All right, let's check for spark. We want to see this light down here turn green when I pull the engine over. Okay, and it's blinking red, which seems to indicate we have spark, but it is weak spark. So I'm going to get the other tester on there, the one that has a 1/4 inch gap. If the spark is strong enough and it jumps the gap, then we should be good. Although I am noticing what looks like a new plug up here. So someone definitely was chasing an engine problem. All right, so keep an eye on this gap right here. That is a 1/4 inch gap. We want to make sure the spark can jump it. So let me kill the lights and pull the engine over. All right, and it looks like we have multiple issues here. So I was going to check compression next, but given that we don't have spark, I think we should dig in and take a closer look at that. So let's get the top cover off and get a look at that coil. It looks like the whole stud's coming with this one. Fuel valve was also left on. Although I'm not sure there's fuel in the tank. If there is, there's only a little bit. Guess we'll find out in a second here. Okay, good. The tank is empty. Okay, so I was hoping to see a chewed or frayed wire, and I'm not seeing it. The wire actually looks to be in good condition. We are in the on position, so the coil shouldn't be grounding out, but let's just unplug it anyway. We'll check for spark one more time. And I think before we spin the engine over, let's get that stud out, because that stud that's stuck in the cover is actually, one of the bolts that holds the coil in place. So we'll get that resecured, rotate the engine, and see if spark came back to this engine. I'm going to get a pair of vice grips on here, although now that I'm looking at it on the underside here, we might actually be able to get a wrench right there to hold things still, and then try the impact to free up that nut. Yeah, I think it's easier said than done. The closed end won't go over. We can probably hold it like that. Nope. The wrench slipped off. It's actually kind of hard to get the wrench fully on there. So hopefully it's not too stuck. There we go. All right, so with the kill wire disconnected, if the coil's good, we should get spark. So I'm also going to add this tester, and we'll kill the lights. And I'm going to rotate the engine with the drill. Look for the spark jumping the gap and that light turning green. Okay. The tester seems to think we have spark, but I did not see it jumping the gap. And it wasn't until I rotated the engine at a pretty high speed that we got anything at all. And that is not normal. So I think we do have a problem with the coil. Well, it's definitely not looking good as far as spark goes. So, ideally I would just swap that coil out. But I do not have any that are compatible with this engine. So, I hate to spend money on something unknown like this until we know it's a viable machine. So there are a few more things we can do just to double check things or potentially fix the issue. So the first one would be the magnets. I did check them and they are still magnetic. So that is not the issue. Potentially the gap is off. It does look a little bit tight. Another possibility too is that we don't have a good connection between the laminations here and the block, which is needed for good spark. So let's remove these bolts. We'll make sure it's nice and clean under here. We'll get the coil reinstalled and gapped and see if that makes any kind of a difference. And before we pull the coil off, let's just see where the gap is right now. That's a 10 thousandths feeler gauge. A little bit loose on the right and definitely tight on the left. But if it's not rubbing on the flywheel, it shouldn't really make a difference. And it looks like a 7 thousandths does fit in there. So I don't think the gap is the issue. Yeah, it's actually pretty clean under there where it makes contact. So likely that is not the issue either. So we'll clean it anyway. I'm thinking while we have the coil off the machine, let's just check the resistance of the primary and the secondary, see if that checks out. All right, so let's check the primary. So multimeter needs to be set to measure resistance. One lead goes on the high voltage side of things and the other just on the lamination. And it should be between usually 10 and 13,000 ohms, which I thought I saw there for a second. Yeah, we're at 12,000 ohms, which seems good. For the secondary, it's between the kill tab and the laminations. Should be between 1 and 2 ohms. And yeah, 1.2, 1.3. So on the surface, the coil does appear to be good. You know, of course, that doesn't tell us if the electronic ignition part is actually good. And just from looking at the underside here, it does look like the coil may have been rubbing a bit on the flywheel. So that could have damaged the coil. Anyway, let's make sure all the surfaces are clean, get it bolted back on, and we'll try it one last time. So I'm just using the business card to set the gap. And with the magnet underneath, you know, that's going to pull it in when the studs are loosened up. Then we snug it down, get the card out, and the gap should be perfect. And now, no spark jumping the gap. So let's pull this out of the way. I'm just going to get a spark plug on the boot and make sure we don't have a problem here with the test equipment. And now there is no spark jumping that gap. So I was ready to condemn this coil. And I'm sure some of you spotted the problem already and have been yelling at the screen for the last 5 minutes. You know, my mistake was just doing what the guy before me did. So when I removed the coil, cleaned it up, regapped it, put it back how it was. But the coil, according to the service manual, is actually upside down. And like that, you're going to get weak or no spark at all. And even if the spark was a strong spark, the timing would also be off. So it's never going to run right like this. So, you know, technically we could spin the engine backwards and I bet we'd see spark. But let's flip the coil over the right way and spin the engine in the right direction. I'm willing to bet that this coil is actually good. And some coils are labeled, you know, this side up. And I'm not seeing it on this one, so it is an easy mistake to make. You know, this is not the first time I've picked up a machine that didn't run because the coil was on upside down. Or I've actually picked up a few that kind of ran, but again, the timing was off and it was backfiring pretty bad. So you flip the coil around and like magic, things start to work. And the compression actually feels like it has come up a little bit from rotating the engine. So we might actually have a good engine here. All right, same test. Watch the tip of the plug. And there we go. Hopefully that comes through. But that is steady, strong spark. So let's check for compression. And actually, before we do that, let's reconnect the kill wire. Make sure we still have spark. Okay, and we do. Let's turn the switch off. We should now not have spark. Okay, good. So it's actually a good thing, I think, that the coil was on backwards. That gives me hope that the pump might still be good. And obviously someone was chasing a problem. You know, the plug looks fairly new. The coil doesn't look new, but potentially this has been sitting a while. A little bit of rust on the plug. Plug itself, though, I'm not sure if the engine's actually fired on it. Anyway, we'll check the compression. It has come up some, but it definitely doesn't feel right. And I'm going to spin it over with the drill. So the number we get from that is probably going to be better than just pulling it over by hand. And I'm actually not going to pull it over too fast because this should have a compression release. So we'll start just rotating the engine slowly. We should get about 60 PSI. And then I'm going to turn the engine over fast and see if that number goes up any. All right, so keep an eye on the gauge with a compression release, usually around 60 PSI, plus or minus about 10. And yeah, we are a bit low. Looks like about 43 PSI, so that is not too good. Let's try rotating the engine over fast, see if that number gets above 100. And no, looks like about 80. So yeah, compression, it's definitely low. So let's pull the valve cover and check the valve clearance. Surprised these are coming out so easily. Yeah, it's stuck on there pretty good. I'm guessing they used some RTV to hold this on. Yikes. Okay, wasn't expecting that. Usually there is some oil in the valve cover, but in this case it looks like all the engine oil is coming out. kind of inconvenient for checking the valves. Okay, so we're in, and it's an interesting design in here. This is actually very similar to the Honda EU 2000. They have a rubber timing belt on an overhead cam. There's only one lobe that runs both valves. So pretty unique design. Anyway, we have the exhaust valve opening. We just want to rotate it until we get to the top dead center of the compression stroke. Now the intake's opening. And now the piston should be coming up to top dead center on the compression stroke, which I believe is right there. And we have plenty of clearance on the exhaust. The intake, I think we have some, but it is tighter. So let's measure those up. So we'll start with the exhaust. It should be 0.08 of an inch, plus or minus 1/1000th. And the 8 fits in there very loose. So yeah, I was actually hoping to find a tight valve, which would explain the compression issues. That is a 12, and that's pretty snug. So we're actually, I would say, at 11, so we are out of spec on the exhaust. The intake should be 0.06. And a 6 does not fit. It's too tight. So let's check something a little smaller, like a 4. And a 4 fits with a good amount of drag. So yeah, unfortunately, neither valve is tight. So yeah, adjusting the valves, I don't think it's going to improve the compression. But since we're here, let's make that adjustment anyway. So according to the service manual, this engine should test at 71 PSI, which I find very hard to believe. You know, I guess they don't clarify on whether that's with the compression release engaged or not. And spinning it over with the drill, I would think would be fast enough to bypass that compression release, but you know, potentially not. So maybe we don't actually have an issue here. So we'll set this one to 8, which is pretty good right there. And we'll snug it up and just double check it. You know, often it changes a bit. Yeah, in this case, it actually loosened it. So an 8's kind of loose. Let's check a 9. Yeah, and a 9's pretty tight, so I'm happy with that. And the intake, I'm going to make a tight 6. Because it'll loosen up probably like the other. Yeah, 6 actually feels good. And a 7 fits, but there is a lot of drag, so I'm good with that. You don't need to split hairs on these valves, but they are a lot closer to where they should be now. So I'm going to spend a second, just clean off this old gasket material, and we'll get this closed back up. Definitely a slow process getting this Honda Bond off. But after you get the chunks off, if you just use some Scotch-Brite and contact cleaner, or even acetone, it cleans off the residual pretty well. So all the surfaces were degreased. I've also got a little thin coat of Honda Bond on the back side of the cover. And the engine's actually tilted back because, you know, even though the oil drained out, it was still dripping. And you don't want the oil, you know, making contact with the Honda Bond, or else you're not going to get a good bond. I'm just snugging these up right now. I'm going to give the Honda Bond a little time to set up before torquing this properly. So I'm going to give that about an hour before I torque that valve cover down properly. So while we wait for that, you know, let's have a look at the carb. Make sure it's clean and good to go. Yeah, I think this bracket has to come out. That way we now have better access. Got to get the choke off, so it's just held in by these bushings. And we can probably, I was going to say we could probably set this off to the side, but the fuel line is still connected. So let's see if we can fish the choke through. There we go. And we'll disconnect the anti-surge spring, the governor arm, and then the only thing holding us back is the fuel line. All right, let's see what we have here. Now, there was fuel in it. A lot of it spilled out actually when taking the carb off, and wow. That is pretty dark. It almost looks like two-stroke, which may not be a bad thing. You know, having a little oil in there is going to help preserve the inside of the carb. Yeah, that looks pretty good. No varnish, no rust. And same thing with the bowl. You know, just a little bit of varnish on the bottom, but not bad. Needle's not stuck. Looks to be pretty good. Yeah, a little discoloration up there, but nothing really bad. So let's see if that main jet will come out of there. Yep, that was not in there too tight. Yeah, it's right there. So sometimes they don't like to drop out. You know, if you use an Allen wrench, of the right size, you can usually push it down. And now this one, not so much. So maybe we have a few more threads here to go. All right, that's the main jet. And the emulsion tube still in there somewhere. So let's see if we can't help it a bit. Just using an Allen wrench. Okay. And last but not least, we got the pilot jet. And that also came right out. So this here, it's actually a cap. The pilot jet is further down. So for that, you need like a little jeweler's type screwdriver. Let me see if I can get that out. Actually, I might be wrong on that one. Makunis have a tiny little jet there that you can remove. This one's a Keegan. And I'm not seeing that it's slotted, so I don't think that comes out. Main jet might be a little bit plugged. Nope. So yeah, carb's in really good shape. It probably would have run the machine as is. But let's just go through everything, make sure, we'll put in the ultrasonic, get it spotless. Then we can bolt it back on the machine and we should be good to go. So we're just about at the hour mark. So I'm going to tighten this cover down to 84 inch-pounds. Okay, so we are nice and clean. We weren't that dirty to begin with, so the carb should run. I think the big question mark really is how well is the engine going to run? The compression seems low to me, but I'm hoping once it runs, which it will run, that maybe that compression might come up a little. So we'll get the float back, as well as the needle. Okay, let's try it out. All right, so getting these back on, it's always a little bit tricky, to say the least. It's kind of like making a sandwich. There's just lots of different layers that have to go on in the right order, all at one time. So we've got the carburetor. We've also got the insulator. So that'll go first, then the carburetor. Then we have this metal plate right here. And then finally, the air box with the studs that hold everything in place. So I'm actually going to start with that. And actually, I forgot we have a gasket as well, which actually doubles as part of the cooling system. So yeah, a few pieces to this puzzle, but we'll get it. Okay, so to make this sandwich, we're going to start with the air box and the gasket. And next we have to put the plate on. And then the carburetor. We have a gasket, which is still good. And we get the studs fed through like that. Then we have this gasket. The insulator. And theoretically, that should do it. Now the breather, I'm not going to worry about quite yet. And actually, I'm missing something pretty important here. Let's get throttle linkage on. And we're losing pieces. Or at least just one. There we go. So I'm just going to make these hand tight for now. We still have all the bolts associated with this bracket, so we want to get everything in. And actually, before I secure it, we actually have to push those bushings in for the choke. And the breather might be easier to add it now as well. So let's try to keep this together. Slide this bushing down, connect it right there in the bracket, and we're losing stuff. So right here, I am struggling to get this choke rod in place. Initially I was blaming it on the bushings, and I didn't realize it until later, but I actually put the choke rod in the wrong position on the choke plate. There's actually two holes there. So, I did have to backtrack a bit after shooting this clip. I had to remake the carburetor sandwich with the choke rod in the right position. Okay, and we also have the fuel line. So, all this stuff really needs to be done before we bolt the carb on. So I'm going to get probably the fuel line on next. And finally the breather. Okay, I think that's everything. Ah, forgot the governor spring. So yeah, there's a lot of pieces to this puzzle, but I think I can still get it on without taking everything apart. Yeah, that did it. And with that, theoretically, this engine should be good to go, assuming it is capable of running. And that I still have my doubts on. Anyway, I am very tempted to fire this up, but we can't do that right now. The Honda Bond, it needs 24 hours to cure, so we cannot add any oil back to the engine until that is ready. So tomorrow, we'll get some oil in the engine, some fuel in the tank. We'll see if this engine is viable and if the pump can build any pressure. All right, it's been over 24 hours, so I think it's time to get some oil in here and roll this thing outside and see if we have enough compression to start this engine. Okay, and we're good. Might be a little bit over full. That is the full line right there. But we are close enough. It's hard to tell exactly where it's coming, but I think we do have a leak, possibly from the pump housing, so it's not looking good for the pump. Yeah, we have pretty much no flow through the pump, which we should. We should be able to purge the air. So yeah, that is another strike against the pump. Anyway, we got the fuel turned on, the ignition's on, we're full of fuel, the choke is turned on. This engine, if it does start, it's not going to run well. If 80 psi is all it has in it. And based on what I'm feeling, I think that's all it has. But let's see if it'll run at least long enough to validate if the pump works. Okay, we got nothing. Let's try it with the choke off. Popped a little bit there, I think. Yeah, it does say easy start, but I don't think it's gonna. And choke back off. And it looks like the rope's about to snap, so we only got a few more pulls out of this. Yep. So I think we're out of pulls. So I'm going to get that recoil off. Let's turn it with a drill at a faster speed and see if it'll come to life. I think we'll be okay. There are bushings here for the starter recoil so you don't torque it down too much and crack the plastic, but without the recoil on there, yeah, that plastic's going to be free to move a little bit. But, you know, if the engine doesn't run, it's not going to be a problem. And even if it does, I think we'll be okay. All right, let's try this again. We'll do choke on. Ignition and fuel is still on. The wand, I do have the handle depressed, but I'm going to leave it down here for now. I need both hands to do this. And we'll just turn it over at a high rate of speed. See if this thing shows any signs of life. And I do have a clutch here, so if it does start, you know, and take the socket, it's not going to twist the drill out of my hand. Yeah, that's not a good sign. How about choke off? Try choke on. Yeah. It's trying, but I think this is his last breath. Got water. Well, the engine still doesn't feel very good, although the smoke was going away. So I thought it was just, you know, rings letting oil past, but I actually think that's going to burn off completely. So I am going to restart it actually with the tip reinstalled, it seemed like, well, I mean, the pump clearly is bad. It is cracked in the housing, so there was water left in it. Although it did kind of seem like it was trying to build pressure. So I'm going to put the tip back on, try to restart it with the drill, and just out of curiosity's sake, see if the pump is still capable of building any pressure. Plus, I want to see if that engine restarts any easier now that we've had it running. Plus, I think that tip was clogged. That was on there, so we'll try this one instead. Yeah, that's a better sign. We do have water flow through this tip. So we'll turn the ignition on. Contact. Nope. I mean, it's barely building any pressure at all right now. But it is building, so we'll try it out one last time here. Well, unfortunately, we don't have a whole lot to work with here. You know, I was hoping the pump was good, but clearly some water was left in it and it froze because there is a crack, I believe, in the housing, which is where the water is coming from. And although we were building a bit of pressure for a while, that stopped about halfway through. So, you know, the pump is bad. The engine is not that far behind. The leak down is still very high. And really the only way you can start it is by spinning that engine with the drill. So the engine is just about done. You know, it needs a rebuild, but given that you can buy these pressure washers on Facebook Marketplace with bad pumps and a good engine for about 40 bucks, you know, rebuilding this engine doesn't make a whole lot of sense. Unfortunately, we have pretty much nothing to work with here. We have a rusty frame, a bad pump, a bad engine, and no hose or wand. This one is actually from my personal machine. So I think I'm going to stick to the original plan and just strip this down and use the frame for testing engines in the future. So for now, I'm just going to roll this out of the way. I'm going to get my other pressure washer out. I actually made a video on that a couple years ago, putting a cheap Amazon pump on it. So let's see if the pump still works and we'll finish the job. Okay, so we'll get the fuel and the oil out. And I was going to say I might need a new battery for this. But you know what? This is one of those smart pumps that it can tell when things are full. So I actually got to hold it up. So we'll get the fuel out and the oil. And then we'll start the teardown. So even though this is a parts machine, this is a great machine to learn on. If you want to learn about small engines, find something like this. That's free. The only thing you can do is make it better and learn something on the way. In this case, you know, we're going to learn fully how to take this engine apart. And there's not a lot of pressure, because if you break something in the process, well, it's already broken. So at least you learn how not to do it, so that if you get one that is easily fixable, you know exactly how to take it apart. That stud came out again. So let's get the fuel line disconnected. So we get the fuel line clamped off. You know, even though we pumped out the fuel, there is still a little bit down there. And just set this off to the side. So before we go much further, let's do a leak down test. Let's put a number to how bad I think the leak down is. So right there, we're in the compression stroke. And there we're at about top dead center. So that's where you want to be when you do this test. Of course, really all you need to do is pull the engine over. When you hit compression, you shouldn't be able to turn it easily through compression. And that's what I just did. So what that means is that the compression, it's leaking out quickly, you know, either through the valves or, you know, maybe the head gasket or past the rings. So, you know, in this case, I guess we'll find out, but I think the leak down is going to be pretty high. You know, I'm thinking around 80, maybe 90%. So right there is top dead center. So we get the leak down tester in there and find out how bad it is. Okay, so we're going to bring up the pressure slowly. And you have to be careful. If you're not exactly at top dead center, you know, the engine's going to rotate. So you might have to reset and try again. Anyway, the gauge on the right is the leak down. The one on the left is the pressure in. You know, ideally these gauges would be tracking with each other, you know, if there was no leak down. And what you want to do is bring this up to 100 PSI in. and then read the leak down on the right. So we're at 100 in, and we're at 60% leak down, which actually isn't as bad as I thought it was going to be. Intake valve is good. All right, exhaust is leaking pretty good. And there's a lot going by the rings. So, it's normal to have some leakage. If we fixed the exhaust valve, that number might actually get up to the green. So, yeah, maybe I'm being a little too quick to condemn this engine. But to fix the valves on this engine, you do have to open the engine up. It's not an easy job because the head, it's not removable. So out of curiosity, I'm going to try one more test here. It's also going to be a leak down test, but the difference is I have the exhaust back on and a piece of rubber kind of sandwiched between the engine and the exhaust. So that is going to plug the exhaust leak. And if we do the same test, then we'll get the leak down minus the exhaust valve. So it'll be the leak down in this case just past the rings. So past the rings, we're at about 53% leak down. So yeah, the rings, they're either stuck, worn, or the cylinder is damaged. So to get the flywheel off, you do need a 2-jaw puller. It's actually labeled on the flywheel pull, and same thing here on the opposite side. The problem is I only have a 3-jaw puller that is large enough to fit over here, and I don't think we can actually get 3 jaws under here, and of course it's not going to be in the spots labeled pull, but let me see if I can get it in there. Otherwise we're kind of dead in the water until I get a 2-jaw puller large enough to fit the flywheel. Yeah, unfortunately, it's not going to work. We can only get 2 of the jaws in, and on a 3-jaw puller, you need all 3. The other way would be to, put this nut on, get a pry bar under there and strike it. That would work. The problem is you got to hit that dead on. And if you miss, which likely you're not going to completely miss, but if you're off center a little, you're going to break off one of these tabs. So I don't think that is a viable option either. So let me give this one some thought. So although we can't swing this, we can maybe rest it on there and strike it with another hammer. Now this is kind of underweight. I don't think it's going to be up to the task, but there's no harm in trying. That did it. Okay, so to get this off, it's an Allen key on the bottom and a 13mm on the top. And there's just 3 bolts going around, so in theory this should be pretty easy. But we are going to be fighting rust, I think. And in this case, this one, not very accessible with this governor arm here. So let's pull that off first. I don't know. That one's on there. I'm afraid I'm going to bend the shaft. There we go. Okay, theoretically the pump should drop right off, but more likely it's rusted to the shaft. Let's find out. No, it is stuck on there pretty good. Let's try something with a little bit more leverage. You can see right there, that's where it was leaking. And we have a crack that runs pretty much to right about there. You can just see it form and then go over the length right here to the unloader. So yeah, unfortunately, there's no saving that pump. So the engine, it is free, but I need to get the valves, or at least the rockers out, and loosen up the camshaft so that we can pull the crankshaft once we have the case open. And it looks like the Honda Bond set up pretty well, so let's try to get that off. I glued it on there too good. Destroying this valve cover trying to get it off. Honda Bond works a little too well, but this cover is just such thin material that you can't hit it that hard. And to get the camshaft out, there is a pin here on the bottom side. So let's tip the engine on its side and pull that pin. All right, so now that's loose. We can probably get the belt off, get the cam out. Okay, and that's all we can do externally. So I'm going to remove the bolts for the crankcase, and that's also glued with Honda Bond. So we're going to have to break that apart to gain access to the inside. And there is a pry point on each side to help break the seal. Okay, so it's moving on that side. Let's break this side free. Not sure what that's about, but we have a bunch of junk down in the sump. It kind of feels like a paper gasket, or actually just sludge. It's kind of disappearing as I rub it. So let's turn this around. And the internals don't look terrible. Looks like we got a shim right there. And not a whole lot to this engine on the bottom end. We have the governor gear, which was on the cover side, and that looks fine. And then just the connecting rod. So let's crack that loose. You know, we can then get the camshaft, or sorry, the crankshaft out. And finally the piston. So the connecting rod journal doesn't look that bad. The skirts also, you know, they show some signs of wear, but nothing terrible. The rings, they're not stuck. So I don't see an issue with the piston. Let's take a look down on the bore. Yeah, I'm not sure what happened to this engine, but there is significant scoring. Kind of looks like a barcode going all the way around. And that, I can catch my nail on pretty much every single one of those. So unfortunately, honing is not going to fix this problem. So honing it, it's not going to fix the problem, but I'm curious to see how much of it will clean up. The other complication here is that this has a non-removable head, so you can't really hone it like you normally would. And what's going to happen is that the stones might bottom out, break off, and even if they don't, we're going to develop a taper pretty quickly because we can't get the full stroke of the hone. But we have nothing to lose. So I'm not going to worry too much about crosshatch right now. I'm just trying to see how many of those scratches will clean up. And from the looks of it, not many. So I'm going to increase the spring tension a bit. Surprisingly, it's cleaning up better than I thought it would. You can still see quite a few lines, but I think the real issue is if you look down towards the valves, there is some discoloration on the side of the cylinder wall. So that is rust and pitting. So I think that's what happened to this engine. There was some rust in there. The piston and the rings scraped it off. And then the flakes of rust probably stuck around the cylinder and created a lot of the scratches that are on there. So, I guess I'm kind of curious to see if the leak down is going to come up any. So I'm going to hone this a little bit more. I'm going to get the piston back in. We'll get this together just enough to run another leak down test. Okay, so we're at top dead center. Let's try this again. We still have the leaky exhaust valve, so if we fix that, whatever reading we get here should be lower by about 5% or so. So we're at 100 PSI in, and the leak down didn't change a lot. I mean, we're at 50%. So if we lapped in the exhaust valve, we could probably get that to about 45%, but yeah, it's not going to run well. You know, ideally we'd be 20% or less, but anywhere in the green, the engine should run. So I think I'm going to call it on the engine. You know, although technically it still can kind of run as long as you crank it over real fast, it is damaged. You know, we saw that when we took the engine apart. We saw that with the leak down test, and the pump, definitely no good. The housing is cracked, and unfortunately, all this was preventable. You know, this was clearly stored outdoors, judging by all the rust, and at some point, water got in here causing all the damage, and the water in the pump froze. So I think if someone actually stored this properly, we wouldn't be here right now. You know, both these things would be working just fine. But at the end of the day, you know, I had no money invested in this, and we learned a lot. We learned how this thing comes apart, how it goes back together, and we have a ton of good parts, including a good carburetor and a coil for a GCV 160, which I didn't have before. So, you know, you can't save them all, but these parts will definitely help to save another. So I hope this video helps someone. Thanks for watching.